Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. It is my great pleasure to have with me my personal inspiration and one of my personal heroes. Doesn't stop me from keeping him waiting, but it is the wonderful Dr. Jay Smith, who, for me personally, I don't know if Jay remembers this, but I met him on one of the summer camps for the Ictus project. He was brought in by Roger Foster.
Ancient history.
Yeah. You were brought in by Roger Foster to do teaching on apologetics and polemics, and me and you had a rapport in those days very quickly, because I was doing this in the north of England, and you were one of the people that kind of really inspired me. I used your material. I often looked for your debates, which in those days were frustratingly hard to find. And now here we are. Talking together. So for me, this is a very happy day. What we're going to be doing today is looking at this issue that has exploded in the apologetics and polemics world, which is these recent admissions by the likes of Dr. Shabia Ali and Dr. Yasser Qadi, that they have acknowledged that there are problems with the traditional narrative of how the Quran comes together and in variant versions of the Quran, including different words. It should be said in their defense and in all fairness, they maintain an orthodox view that the Quran is unchanged, that it's perfectly preserved, but they're obviously retreating from the traditional line that many of us have heard, which is that every letter, dot, and word of the Quran is identical all the way around the world and has been all the way down through history without any change at all. That certainly was the Islam that I was invited to accept. And over time, because of the work of people like Jay Smith and the legendary Hatun Tash, we've seen the Dawa circles retreat progressively away from that statement. It's going to be interesting to see where they settle. And, Dr. Shabia Ali and Dr. Yasser Qadi have almost abandoned the barricades, as it were, and are falling back to some as yet not quite clear disposition. I'd like to throw in another name to all of this, which is Dr. Shehzad Salim, who I don't know if you know him, Jay?
I didn't until you told me, so I went and looked him up. He's from Wales, and he's also very much in this whole camp.
Yeah. He was, even before Dr. Shabia Ali and before Yasser Qadi, he was out there talking about this. Yeah. And in one of the talks.
Where did you hear about him? How did you get to know him?
Oh gosh, I came across his videos months ago. But for me, it was kind of like there's other stuff going on in my life, so I never had a chance to sort of drill down into what he was doing. And then everything that kicked off with Dr. Shabia Ali and Yasser Qadi brought it back to mind. And someone also sent me a link as well, and it just reminded me, oh yeah, I'd come across this before. But one of the interesting things with Dr. Shehzad Salim's study is he points out all the redundant letters that are found in the Hafs 1924 corpus. That the text is full of redundancies. So it's a really interesting video for people to watch.
Where is the video? I've only looked at his at the Amazon site where it talks about and gives us history. Is there a YouTube site we can go to?
Yeah, what I'll do is when you're in the mid flow of the first part of the presentation, what I'll do is I'll then share the link in the chat, and okay. afterwards I'll share it you directly so that you can. It's absolutely fascinating. He's such a great gentleman, very honest, very sincere. I've got no reason to doubt that he's still orthodox in his beliefs, but he's going out there like a proper academic, and he's wrestling with these things that he's finding, without shrinking from or trying to do the apologetics dance, So I'll send you his link. So what we're going to do today, guys, I'm going to let Jay off his leash, as it were, and I know he's going to go at this quite well. We're going to go through the three strands of the evidence that demonstrate that there's a problem with the narrative that we've all heard, which is this unchanged, preserved Quran. And we're going to be looking at some examples from the hadiths, and we're going to be looking at some examples of the Qiraat, or the modern versions that we know of, like Hafs and Wash and Duri. And then we're going to be looking at the issues connected to the Rasim, which I know Jay is eager to point out is the most devastating of all the strands of evidence. That's right, isn't it, Jay? Is it fair?
Yeah, probably in that order. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to do it in that order, and because we're only doing this for an hour, what I'd suggest is you maybe just give one or two examples. So maybe one example from the Hadith, two examples from the Qiraat, and then have three from the Rasim. Is that all right? Do you reckon you could do that? Yeah, and then go from there. So, do you want to just start off? Why did Yasir Qadhi say that there were holes in the traditional narrative of how we got the Quran? What do you think he was talking about there?
Well, this is it's an interesting situation that happened 2 weeks ago. And it was just 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks, Monday, June the 8th, where this all blew open. Certainly, Shabir Ali has said what he said on May 19th. He said that before, but it's the first time that we really paid attention and really took it on board and did videos on it. I think I did 3 videos on Shabir Ali's statement from May 19th. June 8th, though, he was in an interview with Muhammad Hijab. Muhammad Hijab, those of you in London know him well because he lives in London, and he's often down at Speaker's Corner, and he would come down there all the time when I was there in 2015, 2016. He was there when we brought this whole question of the Qiraat, the different Qiraat, to the corner at Speaker's Corner. He was in the crowd, and if you look at some of the videos I put up in the last week and a half, the one especially, if you look at the one where it says, which is
we've seen I pretty much
analysis of Qadhi's crisis of faith. That one there. If you look at that one, it was put up a week ago. I have in the middle of that a video from Speaker's Corner back in 2016, and you will see that Muhammad Hijab he's there in the crowd. He's much thinner. He's very tall, so you can't miss him. But what's fascinating is while we were holding up these 26 different Qurans, every one of them a different Qiraat, while we were holding them up, he was on the side imploring for Muslims to leave, desperate to make sure that they would get away, desperate to make sure that they would not listen or see what we were saying. And you could see that was the crisis of faith that he was going through a good 4 years ago. So this was still continued up until 2 weeks ago when he came to Yasir Qadhi with that same question. Which one of these, now he didn't say that the ones we were holding up, he just wanted to know which was the one. And he wanted Yasir Qadhi to write in a plain piece of paper, if I gave him a blank piece of paper, which Quran are you going to write here? Which is the one that you say is the authoritative one? Is it Hafs? Is it Al-Duri? Is it Qalun? Is it any of these waters, these other 30 that are now official? There are 30 official ones that have been recognized by the authorities within Islam, including Yasir Qadhi. And Yasir did not want to answer that. He was clear that this is not something you talk in public. This is only to be done behind closed door with not amateurs, but with very highly respected Muslims. In other words, those who understood it, those who have a respect for the Quran, who don't go beyond the red line. And he said, there's this red line we don't go beyond. But this is the respect we have for the Quran. We don't go beyond this red line. Now, I'm sitting there watching this, and I'm just sitting there laughing. And I said, red line? There's not a red line in Christianity. There's nothing we can't ask. There's nothing we can't ask of our Bible. We have asked of our Bible for thousands of years, 2,000 years. And here he was saying that there's a red line that no scholar will go beyond. And here was Muhammad Hijab asking him to go beyond that red line and forcing him to do so. And finally, at the end of the 29 or 25 or 29 minutes for that last part of that interview, Yasir Qadhi finally had to admit they're all the Quran, all 30 of them, all 93,000 differences. We've counted 93,000 differences, Bob. 93,000 differences. Has Yasir Qadhi looked at those 93,000 differences? Has he looked at even one of them? Oh, I'm sure he's looked at one or two. I mean, the ones that I always come back to me are always Surah 1, Ayah 4. Maliki versus Maliki. Is it the owner of the day, or this simple one that they always come with? That's the only one they ever come back on. We have 93,000 of these differences. So for him to say that they're all the Quran, all 93,000 differences, suddenly puts pale to any notion that there's one Quran anymore.
Yeah, certainly, and I think the one of the examples that I like, because I've debated the Maliki Malik one, the king and the owner, and it's obviously that not every king is an owner and not every owner is a king. There is obviously some synergy between these two words, but they're not parallels, they're not equals, so they are differences, and that would count to any textual scholar as a textual difference. And I think one of the things that was really telling about Dr. Yasser Kadi was the fact that he said that even our highest scholars, even those that are in the know, even our greatest scholars, would admit that the questions of Aruf and Karat are very difficult and troublesome. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's clearly that if the highest scholars have no certainty, what chance does anyone else have?
Oh, he talked about Al-Jazari, who in 1429 added another 3 qira'at to the 7 that were already chosen by Ibn Mujahid in 936, when Ibn Mujahid chose the first 7. And that was in 936. Look at the date. I always keep reminding people, you need to look at these dates. That's the 10th century, Bob. That's 300 years after Muhammad. Yep. He chose these 7. These 7 were not living at Muhammad's time. They were all living in the 8th and 9th century. This is over 100 years later that they were doing their work. None of them knew Muhammad. None of them were in that place. And they don't even come from that town, from Mecca or Medina. They come from Kufa mostly, or they come from Damascus. And yet when you have Al-Jazari, and God, they brought this up. He said Al-Jazari, probably the greatest scholar on Qira'at, who in 1429, he didn't give the date. I'm giving the date. You need to look at the dates. This is 15th century, when he decided that there were 10 of these Qira'at. That's
which immediately begs the question: is it 7 or is it 10?
Well, it's more than that. There's another 20 on top of that.
Well, exactly. But why was this not clearly decided right from the start? Why is this even a debating point? Why is it even a point of discussion if on this day I have perfected your religion? Not 300 years later.
And what's even more fascinating is that both, certainly Ibn Mujahid said that these 7 that he chose were the 7 that Muhammad knew about in the 7th century. It was the 7 that Muhammad explained and accepted when Umar brought this one fellow who was saying it, who was reciting it different than the way he did it, brought him by the scruff of his neck and planted him in front of Muhammad and said, listen to this guy. And when Muhammad listened to him, he said, oh yeah, there are 7. Where in the world does it say there are 7? Where did Muhammad ever say that? Oh, finally, you understand where that comes from. That comes from the Hadith. That comes from the 9th century. So all these stories about this Qira'at, about these 7, all come starting with Al-Bukhari. They all start with Al-Bukhari, who died in 870. That's the late 9th century, redacting it back to the 7th century. Can you imagine us doing that? Can you imagine us?
Well, I mean, we
Jesus Christ said so-and-so.
We didn't need to. We didn't need to. All of the Gospels were down within the lifetime, within a generation of the events.
Exactly.
The only reason...
2 of them by eyewitnesses who were right there listening to Jesus speak.
Yeah.
How would we defend the speech of Jesus? How would we defend the hadith of Jesus? You hear what I'm saying? The hadith of Jesus. How would we even support or defend the life of Jesus unless we could go to the 1st century itself and know that what John and what Matthew wrote were actually what they saw and what they heard?
Yeah.
But this is nothing. What we're finding out here is everything the Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad did and said are 300 to 400 years later. Sorry. We're talking about 200 to 300 years later. They do not exist at all from the century he came from. And this is why you can see God, he didn't want this to get out in the open. This is what he doesn't want people to see, because it's so much easier to say we only have one Quran. And that Quran can be traced all the way back to Muhammad himself, or at least to Uthman.
Well, I mean, this is why what I'd like you to do now, Jay, is to just bring out one of the problematic hadiths that raise questions. Now, I've done recently a part 1 presentation on some of the problems in the hadith, so people can go and look at our videos, and you'll see there's a entitled video stating, does the hadiths demonstrate a preserved text? But just sort of so we can lay it out for people. Why?
This will take about more than an hour to go through, so I have to go through this very quickly, Bob. But I will just say the hadith you have to go to for the whole story are these 2 right here. These are the 2 that I've been putting up all week, and you've seen me do this. I put it up now 2 or 3 times. It's this one here. This is Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, Hadith number 509, and this one here, Hadith Volume 6, Hadith number 510. One follows the other. This is what happened to how the Quran was first written down. It says this is the only thing they can go to find out how the Quran was written down in 632. at the time of Abu Bakr. This is the first Quran.
Yeah.
All right? That is not as damaging as this one. Then comes this one, because this one comes 20 years later. This is the story during the time of Uthman in 652. So the first one was 632. Now this is 652, 20 years later. And this is where you can just unpack it and you can throw barb after barb after barb. And why Muslims don't want to get us to go to Al-Bukhari. They don't want us to read it. Where else do they go to except here?
Exactly. And without that, what history do they have?
You know, I mean, I'm sure you've heard this, Bob, and those who are listening, they've heard it as well. And here are some of the real problems, and let's go through them real quickly. When you come back to what Al-Bukhari is saying in 652, immediately you see there's difficult, because Hudayfa, it says at the beginning, Hudayfa, who comes to Uthman, the caliph at that time, and he says there are people in the north, in Iraq and Syria, that's north, who are reading it different, who are reciting the Quran different than the way we do down here in Mecca and Medina, in the south, or in the mid part of Arabia. What are we going to do, he says, if they continue doing that? That means they're going to have differences in the Quran like the Christians have in the Bible. We've got to do something about it. So Uthman demands Zayd ibn Thabit, who had written the first one at the time of Abu Bakr in 632, has him come back out again and has him take that copy that he had written back then. Only one copy. Isn't that interesting? Only one copy was made. Given first to Uthman, Abu Bakr, then to Umar, then to the daughter of Umar, Hafsa, who is a widow of Muhammad, and she kept it under her bed. Now, what does that tell you right away? What does that say about this copy? Not very important, not very significant. Absolutely, they don't really care. As long as it's written down, they don't care what happens to the Quran. So is it no wonder that there's suddenly all these different Qurans popping up all over in the north, up in Shams, up in Syria and Iraq? So 20 years later, by that time, there are many different Qurans, and we know this is not just recitation, because you're going to see what it says next. When Zayd ibn Thabit takes that copy, what does Uthman tell him to do? To write it in the Qurayshi dialect, which means in the Meccan and Medinan dialect. To write it in the Qurayshi dialect. I'm not going to get any deeper than that. That's all you need to know. Hold on to that. That's hugely significant, which he does. He writes it in the Qurayshi dialect, and then Uthman takes and he sends it out to 4 cities. It could be 9, it could be 4. Let's go with 4. He sends it to Basra. He sends it to Baghdad. He sends it up to Damascus. Listen, where Basra and Baghdad are, that is part of the Shams. That's Iraq. Damascus is Syria, and leaves 1 in Medina. So really only 1 of these Qurayshi dialects is there in what we know as Medina. The others are sent to the other cities. Once that has happened, he then takes all the other manuscripts. So there were many other manuscripts, evidently. And he burns them. Now, Bob, why would you burn manuscripts?
Well, because they're different.
They disagree.
They disagree. That's exactly why you would destroy. If they all matched, you wouldn't bother destroying them. Or certainly you wouldn't destroy whole copies, because a whole copy that matches the whole copy you've got is just an extra whole copy for you, isn't it?
There you go. Obviously.
And these are expensive things. That's something people have got to appreciate. It's not cheap to produce a book.
Because they're made from animal skin. They're made from animal skin.
This is an expensive material. It's an expensive process. So the only reason to suppress them is if they could be the cause of disagreement.
Okay, so that right in there in the hadith, you see there's a problem here. Now, I'm going to just bring up another problems. First and foremost, why would God, in his wisdom, even create another book in a language that could not even accommodate his revelation? Arabic was so poor, was so barbaric, yet was so unsophisticated that you couldn't even read the Arabic that it was put in. So when you look at the oldest manuscripts, like the Samarkand or the Topkapi, I may have some pictures in here. Well, you know what I'm talking about. When you look at any manuscripts, they don't have any dots above them or below the line. They don't have any vowelization. They have no diacritical marks. And the Arabic that existed back in the 7th century was only about 15 letters. That's it. Today, it's 28 letters. How is it we've gone from 15 to 28? Between 17
the development, the language needed to evolve.
Exactly, because the Arabic could not accommodate it. Just one little a bold shape like this could be 5 different letters. You need to know which letter you're looking at, so you have to either put a dot above it. That's a na. 2 dots is a ta. 3 dots is a tha. 1 dot below is a ba. 2 dots is a ya. Not a tha ba ya. That's 5 different letters it could be once you get those dots in place. But those dots weren't there in any of the earliest manuscripts.
And I think what that demonstrates is that the original Kufi script was being used as an aid memoir which links, therefore, the idea of an oral tradition to a written tradition. So one is supporting the other. You can't just separate the two out.
Okay. And that's why you need to have the Qurayshi dialect. But you can't write a Qurayshi dialect in a printed script. So even that notion that where Uthman saying write it, he didn't say it, not recite it in the Qurayshi dialect. He said write it. How can you write it if you have dots to make that distinction?
And if the oral, because we are told by the apologists, the Dawah team, that it's all oral tradition, it's all preserved in the oral tradition. Well, if that was the attitude of everyone back in the 7th century, the empire that was emerging would have just invested in recitation schools.
Okay, if that were the case, if it was only oral, then why did they have to burn the manuscripts?
Exactly. That's the point.
You don't burn people's tongues. You don't burn people's recitation. You burn manuscripts. If it was only dependent on orality, why did Abu Bakr even need to write it down to begin with? What was the reason he had to write it down? Because they just had a battle called the Battle of Yamama in 632. 70 of those who had memorized it were killed in that battle. Knowing that if that caused a crisis right there, does that show you that memorization is not good enough?
No, yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And also it demonstrates that the pool of people, and if you read the hadiths very carefully, it's clear that there's one person that remembers one of the verses. So one of the verses is found with one of the people, which means that no one has a complete copy in their mind or in text of the Quran.
Well, that was only in 632 that he found one with one person. What about when you get to 655? He finds another one with another person. Well, what happened in those? What if there were 500 verses that people hadn't remembered because they had all been killed at the Battle of Yamama? What about those who had died? How many verses did they die with?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is all what we're getting from the hadith. So I'm just looking within the hadith. I'm not confronting the hadith right now. I'm just saying, even when you look and see what they say, there are enormous amount of problems. Secondly, why would God have chosen somebody who can read and write to be his prophet, to give the final greatest revelation in the history of mankind?
Especially when it's dependent on a book.
Exactly. The whole reason why the whole mission for Muhammad is to receive this Quran. If he's given that mission, then why in the world didn't he learn to read and write? He had 22 years to do so, from 610 to 632. All you need to know are 15 letters. See, back then, there were not 28 letters. There was only 15. It wouldn't take very long to learn 15 letters, thank you. I learned 28 letters within 2 weeks.
I've just started Arabic. So.
It's very easy to do. So more than that, he had a secretary. What do secretaries do if they don't write things down? Isn't that the job of a secretary? So why did Said ibn Thabit, his secretary, write it down? To me, it's just unfathomable. If this is the greatest revelation for the history of mankind, yet he forgot to write it down during his lifetime. And that's why Abu Bakr had to do so after he died, because all these reciters, all these ones who had memorized it, who supposedly are the only repositors for this revelation, if they were all dying off, then they quickly had to write it down. Once they wrote it down, 20 years later, they had to rewrite it again. And this time they had to do it in a completely different dialect, of which there is no means of writing it down, because the way to understand, to write dialectical differences had yet to be invented. That doesn't get invented until the 8th century. Are you following me? No one's talking about this. You've got to see what we're dealing with here. But it gets even worse once you get to the Qira'at. Now we go to the Qira'at. And I see we've got a half an hour, so we need to really get into this. What is the problem with the Qira'at? Once you start adding these dots in, so you start making different words, you start making different letters, there's many ways you can make these different words. You can have, if you just take just take 3 of these smiley faces and put dots above and below it, you can get up anywhere from 19 to 30 different words just with 3 consonants put together.
Yep.
There is the problem. So, Bob, you come up with one word, I come up with another. Let me just give you some example here. If with just those 3 words put together, I'm going to just give you this here. I have it right here on my screen. If you put 3 words together, 3 smiley faces, depending on you put where the dots above and below the line, you can get house, it sprouted, stayed over, a girl, daughter, she built, stood firm, grew, repent, he repents, she repents, he spreads, he broadcasts, she spreads, we spread, he fixed, he made firm, she destroyed, we destroyed, you destroyed, it was destroyed, I repented.
That's a
Those
big.
are all
That's a
words you
big.
can get just from 3 different letters, depending on where you put the dots. But almost all your words in Arabic have 3 letters. In fact, if you go to an Arabic dictionary, in order to see what a word is, you always start with the 3rd person singular, because that's only 3 letters. And then you build off from them on either side, depending on if it's male, female, or if it's plural and singular. And that's why you start with those words. So the dictionary, Arab dictionary, always starts with the third person singular, male person singular.
Hmm.
With that case, then, can you then understand just 3 letters together? I've just given you now 19 different ways of saying that, of using that different word, depending on where you put the dots. Then you can understand why all these scholars, these readers, and we're talking about 7 to begin with, 7 readers who they're in the, almost all of them, and looking at them, are 8th century. This is 8th century, so this is 100 years later. They are then given the task of now, with all these dots, how are they going to construct these words, these sentences, these verses, these surahs of 6,636, I think it is. I can't remember exactly how many verses there are in the Quran.
Fair enough.
What it is, 6,636? I think it's around that. So over 6,000 verses, everyone's going to have a completely different set of categories or what they're going to say. And it all depends on the context. But a lot of them, the context, as you've read the Quran, read and see how much context there is.
Yeah, it kind of jumps around a bit as a narrative, doesn't it? It's not a...
Stories don't begin, stories don't end. They just jump in the middle of a story. They don't have one transitional phrase to go back the other. There's only one complete story in the entire Quran, and that's the story of Joseph in Surah 12. So can you understand the difficulty for all those readers who had to then somehow make sense of all this jumble of words? And by that time, now they had 28 letters, not 15. They had 28 letters to work with, so they could make and choose and make all kinds of combinations and recombinations. And so you have one school. You have the schools that were very popular in Kufa, which is in Iraq. Another school that became very popular in Damascus. Another school of Qira'at that became popular in Medina. Another school that became popular in Mecca. So you have 5 different cities where these different schools are becoming popular. But this is all 8th and 9th century. And then by the 10th century, then you need someone to say, well, which one of these schools actually has the authority? So you have Ibn Mujahid in 936 say, I'm going to choose these 7. So he chooses Nafi from Medina. He chooses Ibn Kathir from Mecca. He chooses Ibn Amr al-A from Basra. He chooses Ibn Amir from Damascus, Asir ibn from Kufa, Hamza al-Zalik from Kufa, and al-Kisa'i from Kufa. So 3 from Kufa. Notice 3 from Kufa. Isn't that the Shams? Isn't that Iraq? Isn't that what Uthman said not to go to when he told Zayd ibn Thabit to write it in? The 3 of the major schools are from Kufa. The other one is Damascus. And in Basra, that's also Iraq. So of the 7, 5 of them are from the places you're not supposed to go to because they have a completely different recitation.
So the formative cultural milieu in which the Quran emerged wasn't even in Saudi Arabia proper.
No. Only 2 of them were from Mecca and Medina. The other 5 were all from Iraq, and 4 from Iraq and 1 from Damascus.
And also, it's the very fact that you've the Dawah team boast. It's kind of like, well, you never hear Muslims arguing about how many chapters are there in the Quran or how many verses there are in the Quran. Or I mean, the hadiths definitely demonstrate there was dispute about how many verses there were in the Quran. But in terms of these emergent 7 ways of reading this consonantal script and the way that it evolved, this is based upon Ibn Mujahid.
Ibn Mujahid from the 10th century. He names these 7. All of them are from the 8th and 9th century. Not one of them is from the 7th century, who are rooting their material in the 7th century. Why did Ibn Mujahid think that through? Because what he says then these are the 7 that Muhammad chose. No, they're not. For 2 reasons. No. One, Muhammad wouldn't have any diacritical marks to use to even know what they are. The recitations, none of these guys knew Muhammad. None of these guys were from Mecca, except for 2 of them. But they weren't there when Muhammad was living. They were living over 100 years after Muhammad died. Not one of them was doing their work in the same century Muhammad was living, in the 7th century. Can you see how stupid this was? Ibn Mujahid had to say, these are the 7 that I have chosen in the 10th century that were living in the 7th century, who were there when Muhammad was living, and it was he that was saying, these are the 7 I choose. So
give us an example.
How idiotic that sounds.
Give us we know the sort of king and owner example, but there's another one, isn't there, which I think is really good. I don't know if it's Wash and Hafs, but it's the idea of fought and killed.
Yeah, I've got it right here.
Yeah. It's as one of the differences. So what we've got is we've essentially got at least, if we accept the 7, bearing in mind that Muslims themselves debate whether there's 3 more, we've got at least 7 versions of the Quran.
No, we don't. So far, we haven't had Hafs or Wash yet. Hafs and Wash are not part of those 7. They're not part of those 10. Ooh,
So what are you saying then that we've got at this moment in time? At this exact moment in time?
By 1429, we only have 10. Because another 3 were added by Al-Jazari in 1429, or just before he dies. That's the 15th century. So by the 15th century, we have 10. 10.
Right. So if we've got...
So are not part of those 10. Hafs and Warsh still haven't been chosen.
Okay, so at this point in time then that we're talking about, we've got 10 different versions of the Quran, of which out of those 10 emerged the Hafs and the Warsh, is what you're saying?
They are not introduced till much later, and no one really can tell me when Hafs and Warsh, because they're part of the 20 who are the narrators. See, each one of those 10 has 2 narrators who come about 100 years, come many years later. Many of them, they never knew them because they were living too much later. They were in the late 8th and the 9th century. That they were living. So they were 8th and 9th century that they have these narrations that are different from the readers. And we have been able to find 93,000 differences. So these aren't just 1 or 2. We're just looking at 1 or 2 now. What about the 93,000? All these. Now, of these, Hafs and Warsh are not part of Ibn Mujahid's list, nor are they part of Al-Jazari's list. They come from another list that are added even later. So can you see
what's the gap? What's the gap between...
Why have no one has brought this forward?
What is the gap between Ibn Mujahid and Hafs? What's the gap between those 2 points?
We don't know because Ibn Mujahid is 10th century. Hafs is 796, so he is earlier than Ibn Mujahid, but he is not chosen. He is not chosen by Ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid never chose Warsh or Hafs. Neither did Al-Jazari. The 10 that they did choose are not the 2 that we're using, the most common that we're using today.
Okay, that's a really interesting claim. I thought, fair enough.
Have you not heard this before?
Well, I had got it in my head in a slightly different order. So I thought that out of the 7 that were chosen originally, that Hafs and Warsh emerged from that 7 as part of the chain of continuation.
The Hafs and Warsh, I'm just going to give you right now. Warsh does come from Nafi al-Madina, but he is he is not the Nafi al-Madina. He is a narrator from Nafi al-Madina, who is from Medina, from the Hijaz. Hafs is from the chain of Asim ibn Abi al-Najud, who is from Kufa. So he comes as a student, but never knew him because he never studied under him because he comes too far long after him.
So what is a narrator? Just give us a simple definition of we've got these narrators that you've spoken about. What do we mean by a narrator? What are we saying?
Basically, they're transmitters of this school, and the school of the 7 and the 3, which makes 10. Each one of those 10 has transmitters that take what they have given and then they add and they change their text later on, 50 to 60 years later on. That's all. But each one, there are many more than that, by the way. But these are the 2 that are recognized by later scholars as being the authentic one. I'm getting some feedback. Are you hearing feedback?
Yeah, I'm getting feedback. I think it's coming through on your microphone.
Okay, let me produce something.
And it's feedback. So if you stick in stick in a headset.
I'll stick in earphones, and that should just stop it. Just so we don't.
You might have to stop moving. I saw the one with you and Hatun.
Well, that was it was another set of earphones that ticking every time I moved. Let's try this. Is that better?
Yeah, so far. Brilliant. So so give us some examples of the differences between these qira'at.
All right, let's just do the most famous are Hafs and Warsh, because Hafs was then chosen. Hafs was not chosen as the standard qira'at until 1924. So we're talking about 94 years ago.
I guarantee everyone who's watching this has already heard you say that. So what I'm looking at is the examples. We're looking at why we're saying that there's differences. Like the examples.
Well, let's just take the one you want. Chapter 3, verse 146. Chapter 3, verse 146. Hafs has qatala. So it says, and how many a prophet fought with whom were many worshippers of the Lord. So that's what it says in the Hafs. In the Warsh, which is the most popular qira'at that's used all over North Africa, and for many, but it still is today the most popular one. It says kutila, so it's complete 2 different vowels. The vowels have changed. So you remember, you instead of a as a fatha, they have now changed it to a dama, kutila, and have put a kasra after T, under the T.
Hmm.
It used to be a fatah, now it's a. So this is vowelization changes. This is not dots changes. This is vowelization. The dhamma kasra fatah. So that means killed. So how many prophets were killed? So either they fought or they were killed. Now the significance of this, if you're a prophet, I would like to know that I fight, but not that I'm dead.
Yes, absolutely. There's a massive difference between
Huge
fighting and
difference.
being killed.
Talk about theologically speaking.
Because many people who fight survive.
There you go. So did they fight or did they die? Which is it? In the process of fighting, were they killed? So that's hugely significant. There are so many others. The one that Shabbat Ali is confronting us on is chapter 98, verse 6. Which is al-Baraiti versus al-Bara'ati from Warsh and Hafs. I've only used Warsh and Hafs because there's so many thousands of tens of thousands. I've just used, you have to bring it down because it just goes over people's head. So I've only put up a 5 or 6 on the internet so far. When we were down at Speaker's Corner and we held up those 26 Qurans, the very next day we did a studio copy and we looked at 70 of these differences, just 70 of them. And that was overwhelming. That was just too overwhelming for most people.
What's the second example?
Well, here you have creatures versus the innocent. So it's talking about those who are Christians, indeed, those who disbelieved among the people of the scripture, that's us, and the polytheists, that's the kafirs, will be in the fire of hell. So we're going to be, if we disbelieve, we're going to be in the fire of hell, abiding eternally there, and those are the worst of creatures. That's what it says in the Hafs. Al-Bari'ati. Now, in the waters, it says al-Bara'ati. So it's a different, in this case, it's a different vowelization. Here it says, indeed, those who disbelieve among the people of the scripture, the polytheists who are in the fire of hell, abiding eternally there, those are the worst of the innocent. So it changes not only the words, theology.
Yeah, because that would mean that innocent people are being sent to hell.
Why in the world are innocent being in hell? And if it's against me as a Christian, I'd like to know if I'm just a creature or if I'm the innocent. See,
so as well as being a textual variant, you've got there a logical inconsistency.
There you go.
The idea of innocence being in hell. So that would mean that in this case, the Hafs Quran makes actually more sense than the Warsh Quran.
And that's why, in many respects, when you do a comparison, the Hafs usually always makes more sense. There are many cases where the plurality versus singular are changed in other texts that are not in the Hafs, and the Hafs usually gets it right. And that's why we think the Hafs was the one that the Ottomans chose, and that's why I think Muhammad Ali ibn al-Hishami al-Huzaini, Badawi, the one who actually did the choosing in 1924. Well, that's why we think that he chose Hafs, because it was the one that the Ottomans had chosen. Now, understandably, he didn't explain why he chose the Hafs. And this Muhammad ibn al-Huzaini al-Haddad should have made some reference as to why this one is superior, since Hafs is not the Qurayshi dialect. And if he had read volume 6 of al-Bukhari that we just read a few minutes ago, if he'd read that, he would have seen that that's the very thing Uthman said not to use. Do not use Shams. Do not use Iraqi. Use the Qurayshi dialect, which one means it should have come from Medina. It should have come from these 7, at least the 7 that Ibn Mujahid had chosen. And I think this is something I wish Al-Haddad were here today, so he explained why he chose an individual that was living in 796, a good 240 years after Uthman, and was choosing and was living in a place that from the very environment which Uthman very clearly said you're not to use. Why in the world they go with Hafs? But that's just the Qira'at damage, and that's why when good old Yasser Qadi said we don't want to talk about that. This is a big hole that we have left a big hole that we haven't been able to fill. Well, we're filling it for them. We're going into that hole because we don't stop.
I think we're digging it, really, to be fair. I don't think we're filling it. I think we're digging it. It's kind of like because and here's a really dramatic problem. If we are genuine about searching for truth, if we take that search seriously, then every question should be on the table. There shouldn't be any question that's off the table, because if truth is truth, it will be internally coherent, it will not contradict reality, and it will work in practice. Yeah. Whereas if something is, so when you test it, it should stand up to scrutiny. And there are many dogmas of that Christians have accrued over the thousands of years that don't stand the test of time. You know, they're very disputable dogmas. But for instance, you know, like but with the exception of the crucifixion and the resurrection, which have been drilled and tested, and belief in the Trinity has been drilled and tested, it stands up to historical scrutiny, it stands up to logical scrutiny, it stands up to the scrutiny of what happens if you build your life on it. So there should be no question off the table when it comes to the Quran, because if it is everything that it is claimed to be, then any examination will simply be confirmation. But what we're seeing actually is that examination is contradiction.
And Bob, the problem is the Quran itself. The Quran makes these claims. It's not just Yasir Qadhi making these claims. It is not Muhammad Hijab making the claim. The Quran says so in chapter 10, verse 15, in chapter 15, verse 9, in chapter 18, verse 27. It says very clearly that God will protect it from corruption. He will protect it and guard it from any accretion or deletion or any type of corruption that would come subsequent to it being revealed. So on that note alone, can you see the dilemma for Yasir Qadhi and Shabirali over here in the West? They're the academics who now are in a different world than Muhammad Hijab and Adnan Rashid and all the ones you have to deal with there in London. Those you have to deal with at Speaker's Corner don't live in the world Yasir Qadhi is. They don't have to answer to Western criticism, but Yasir Qadhi does, and so does Shabirani. They live in that academic world, and to continue their academic credibility, he had to say what he said. God bless him for doing that. What's happened subsequent to that, though, has made me absolutely shamefacedly look at Yasir Qadhi and say, what kind of idiot are you? You should have just stayed with what you said, because now he's blocking anybody who disagrees with him. And he's trying to shame us all by saying, for those of us who are having this debate, having this discussion like we're having today, that we're nothing more than Islamophobes, that we're Muslim haters. Since when does what we're talking about have anything to do with hatred of Muslims?
Well,
or that we are Islamophobic?
Yeah.
And that doesn't do Yasir Qadhi any favors, because he's going to have to answer to that kind of talk, that kind of description, when he gets back into Yale University, his alma mater, or when he gets back into any convention or conference where there are other Western academics there who are going to say, what do you mean? This is a perfectly legitimate question that they're asking. These are perfectly legitimate questions that Muhammad Hijab asked. And for those of us who are in the West, who are used to that kind of criticism, who expect it of the Bible and other pieces of literature, to have him call us, name call us, and then to block us, and then to even attack David Wood and try to get his videos struck off, to stoop that low. You don't stoop that low, not in Western academia, and his whole Western credentials is now in doubt. And I would say
it's dog whistle apologetics. It's kind of like, I can't beat your argument, so I'm going to just label you and libel you and say that you're something that you're not. You know, I think, and sadly, it's a trope that is so very often used, especially by the Dawa team, who have lost the argument. You know, they run away from Hatton around the corner. They run away from me. They've lost the argument, and all they've got left is to libel and to blackmail. How is an interrogation of the truth based upon hatred of a people? You know, if I interrogate the Quran, that's making no statement about 1.2 billion people. Statements, but by their logic, that means that if we were going to apply their logic so that it went in both directions, that would mean that any criticism that they make of Christian belief makes them guilty of Christophobia.
But that word doesn't even exist.
It should, but it's kind of
why does that word not exist? Because we have allowed everybody to criticize the Bible. We have allowed everybody to criticize our Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, there would not be any biblical history. I mean, there would not be any historical criticism. There would be no such thing as redactic or source criticism. All of these were created on the Bible, because the Bible can take this criticism, because Jesus can take this criticism. It's obviously that the Quran cannot. And it's obviously the Muslims
marshaled this, like the earliest church, one of the church fathers, like Origen the Imperfect, because he does get a lot of his theology wrong. He was doing textual criticism. Saint Augustine was doing textual criticism. Desideri Erasmus was doing textual criticism. Galileo Galilei did some textual criticism. You know, the Christians have been doing textual criticism. It is something that is emergent from Christians, because we had the confidence of our beliefs. But it resulted in Christians having to change some of their beliefs.
Mhm.
It resulted in it, that we had to change some of our perceptions of the Bible, and we had to come to a more nuanced understanding of what the Bible is and how it is revelation, rather than a simplistic one.
And Bob, wouldn't you say that because of that tradition that you just named so well, all the different people right down through the ages who have been textual critics, because that has infused our entire educational system here in the West, that we assume that everything is open to criticism. And that's why when Qadi was saying that we have a respect for the Quran and that we have a red line beyond which we don't go. But when he got to Yale University, he suddenly found out that there are all these other questions that people were going to, because they didn't have that red line. Where do you think that whole process came from? It came from biblical criticism. It came from the whole ethos right down through the last 2,000 years, where Jesus allowed criticism, where Jesus allowed people to spit at him, to whip him, even to crucify him. And look at his response: Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's the kind of model we look at in the person of Jesus Christ from the very beginning, 2,000 years ago, that we're still using today. We allow people to criticize Jesus. He allowed people to criticize him, even to kill him. And because of that, that has been infused. I would say that has infected all of Western Judeo-Christian society, and also our intellectual and our also educational system.
If you look at the hagiographies of the saints and the martyrs, then you will find that they often go into places, to the Mongols, to the Slavs, to the Germanic tribes, to the Danes, to the Vikings, and they went into the Roman pagan world, and they engaged people in debate. They engaged people in discussion. We can't romanticize Christian history. There was definitely, when the church had power, it has demonstrated its ability to be intolerant. So I don't want to romanticize, Christian history, but the thing is, Christians had the confidence of their beliefs to engage in any question. That has genuinely been something that Christians have been open to, and Christians.
And Yasser Qadi found that out when he went to Yale University, and he had a crisis of faith at that time, because he didn't know that these kind of questions would be asked of his scriptures. So how did he answer that? And this is what's fascinating. What he did, and he went into a mantra. And this is the mantra that he said when he was asked, what did you do with this crisis of faith? I took notes of everything that he said. He said, I finally had to realize that the Quran is the uncreated speech of Allah. The Quran is preserved. The Quran is known. The Quran is mutawatir. All of the Qur'an are the Quran. All are authentic. Leave it to that. Leave it at that, Muhammad. Beyond this requires background information. Just take my class. It is enough to know the Quran is the speech of Allah. It is protected. He went into this mantra, and I've heard this so often from Muslims at Speaker's Corner. Once you confront them and get them into a corner where they have no recourse, they just go into this mantra again. It's almost like, don't bother me. I know it's preserved, but don't ask me how. I just know that it is eternal. I just know that Allah will preserve it. Don't ask me how. It's not for me to explain. And they just go into like this mantra, this memorized speech, which is exactly what he did right there on camera. And I just said, I've seen this before. This is what I got at Speaker's Corner for 25 years.
Yeah, it's irrelevant of evidence or facts. So speaking of evidence or facts, I'd like to, because my time with you is only short, I'd like to start to focus in a little bit on the rasim. Okay. Because as you have so keenly said, this is the most destructive of all the evidence. So we've got three strands of evidence to this argument. Firstly, it's the fact that the hadiths suggest that there are variants in the Quran. I think, to me, the hadith seemed to suggest that actually what was the Quran revealed by Muhammad was much bigger at his time than what ended up in a book. Then we've got this development of these qira'at, which are different versions of the Quran, and they have different words, as we've run through a couple of examples, and those different words impact the localized theology of the verse. So they impact the localized meaning of the verse, but I think it's fair to say they don't compromise any of the major doctrines of Islam, with the exception of the idea that all the Qurans are the same, which is a kind of, seems to me like a modernist invention. But then we've got the Rasim, and I'm going to let you talk about it, but just as a bit of an introduction.
You've got to go back to this one. This is the book that changed everything, and it's only been out a year. We introduced it at Speaker's Corner on May 26, 2019. We got up there, we introduced it, and all the major players were there. Muhammad Hijab was there, Anand Rashid was there, Ali Dawa was there, Mansour Ahmad were there. They were all there at the corner. Mansour Ahmad finally put his ladder up and tried to confront us on this and try to say that this is nothing more than scribal errors. These are scribal errors. They just made a mistake and they had to be corrected later on. That's all it was.
Yeah.
Let me just show you this right here. Can you see that? I'm going to try to get it so you can see. Can you
Bring
see there are
a bit closer.
There are 9 boxes. You can see there are 9 boxes.
Right, hold it there. That's good.
If you look closer, you can see the name Allah has been introduced in all 9 of them above the line, or they've put it sandwiched in between other different letters, other different words.
Yep.
Now, each time, this is one manuscript. There are 12 of these. Dan has only put 9 here just to explain what is going on. In every case, except for one, you don't need Allah's name there. Allah, the name of God, is understood by the context of the verse. So why have they added Allah? They're redundant. So why have they put Allah there? Why have they added it? And you can see it's in a different nib. It's in a much more fine nib. It's a different color, if you can see it in color. And it is not in the text. It's above the text, or it's to the side, or it's sandwiched in, so it's scrunched in. In every case, when you put Allah there, it now supports this text. This text that was chosen in 1924. If you kept them there, and that shows that they're in 12 different places, the name of Allah, the most important name of God, is missing in. And this is the one from this is the manuscript that is in Doha. No, sorry, this is from the Sana'a manuscript, which is in Metropolitan Sana'a, which is in Sana'a, not the Metropolitan. This is the Sana'a manuscript, which is in Yemen. So that's just one example. Let me give you another example here. Here's another example. Take a look at this. Can you see that there's been an eraser, a complete eraser?
Yeah, it's clearly been rubbed out.
There is part of the word, and then there's an eraser. We don't know. It's obviously that there was a word there, or probably there were 2 words there. Now they're no longer there. They've been erased. What's been left behind now supports this text. This is not a scribal error. This is intentional human intervention. These are intentional human interventions. And this is the Marsil 2. Then I want to show you the Husseini. This is the one that Adnan says we should go back to the Husseini, because the Husseini is 99% correct, and it's from before 719.
Did he actually use those words? Did he actually say 99% correct?
99% correct, and it's from.
So he's admitted that it's 1% incorrect. Is that what he's saying? How can you have a 1% incorrect in a perfect book?
It gets worse than that. I want to show you this. So he says it's 99% correct. Take a look at this one page from the Husseini manuscript.
Yeah.
I count, let me see. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different coverings. 8 different coverings. I'm sorry that I can't get it bigger than that, but you can get the book yourself. 8 different coverings from one page. There are so many coverings on this one page that what's left behind just look like chicken scratches. It's almost impossible to read. You can, if you put them all together, you can read it. And what it reads now supports this text, supports this razm. See, there is no dots here. There are no vowels here. There's no diacritical marks. These are only the 15 letters that were used in the 7th and 8th century.
Yeah, that, ladies and gentlemen, is Kufic script that you're looking at.
This is Kufic script because it's elongated here. So, but nonetheless, it is from the early. This is from the Husseini manuscript, which is fascinating because Altaf Kulic and Ekmeldin Sanlu, who wrote this tome, this study, which they took 5 years to do. They are both Muslim scholars. They are the first ones to actually look at all the major manuscripts, and they date the Husseini to the late 8th century to the early 9th century. Look at the dates. Ooh, so even by the late 8th century and the early 9th century, they're doing changes. They're doing coverings. Of course, the coverings are done many, many years later. That's fascinating that even the late 8th century, early 9th century, they still don't have the same Quran. So what is the problem with all these changes? Well, when I first did my first debate on this in 2014 with Dr. Shepard Ali in Toronto, at that time, I only had Dr. Brubaker's doctoral thesis. And at that time, he only had 800 of these changes. I've just shown you 3.
Only.
I've just shown you 3. 800. And these were coverings. These were erasers. These were insertions. These were deletions. These were coverings with writings over top of them. And so when you see all these hundreds and hundreds of data, you've said, you've got to be, this is intentional human intervention. And in every case, they're standardizing the text. So in 2014, Dr. Shepard Ali couldn't deal with one of them. He didn't answer one of them. It's the first time he looked at them. And I'm saying, if you're one of the leading scholars in the Islamic world and you've not even looked at these variants, how can we trust anything you say? How can you continue saying there's one Quran? And he spent 19 minutes, I kid you not, talking about the miracle of the number 19.
Yeah, I watched that debate.
That was all that he supported himself.
That
What a
was one
waste of 19 minutes.
It was a great debate. You won it hands down.
But I think that was, now we've come up, we're now 2020, and what has Dan Brubaker found? He's found 4,000 of these. He has now started his own YouTube site. You can go up and see it. It's called Quran Variant. What a name. I love it. The name of the YouTube suggests exactly what he's talking about. Yeah. Go up to Quran Variant and just look and see what he has found. I'm just going to go up to it real quickly right now. When you look at the Quran Variant, I'm looking at another screen here. It all now right. Oh, he's only put up one video so far. And on that, he has already received 7,000 subscribers in just 1 week. 7,000 subscribers. Boy, I wish I could claim that for myself. That's how popular this is. 23,000 people have watched that video on just the first variant. And he's going to be putting up every week a new one, a new video with variant after variant till he gets all 4,000. And it'll be many more thousand by the time he gets to those. And this is something Muslims need to look at, because we're not talking about qira'at now. We're not talking about dots. We're not talking about vowels. We're talking about consonantal skeletal text. These are the original 15 letters that are changed, and they change words, and they change verses, and they change entire theologies. This is much more damaging than the Qur'an. And these are the earliest manuscripts. We're not looking at 8th and 9th and 10th. We're looking at 7th and 8th manuscripts. Can you see then why, Bob? This is something Yasir Qadhi has not gone to. When Yasir Qadhi made that statement there in the interview, that the whole Qira'at, problems with the Qira'at, is the most difficult question for Muslim scholars. No, it isn't. This is by far much more difficult. And I'm waiting to see any Muslim that will even acknowledge or even accept that the Quran we have in our hand today is not the Quran that's eternal, as it says in 85:22. It is not the Quran that Muhammad received between 610 and 632. It is not the Quran that Abu Bakr created in 632, nor the Quran that Uthman created in 652. This Quran doesn't even come from the 7th century. So when did this Quran, I'm not talking about the Hafs text, I'm talking about the consonantal text. I'm talking about the skeletal text. When did the skeletal text of the 15 verses, the 15 letters, when was it finally written down? There you go, Muslims. Tell me, show me, and give me a manuscript that has 114 surahs with the skeletal text intact, the same as the Hafs text that we have here today. I'll leave you with that.
And I think there's a couple of points that come to mind as you were talking. Like, firstly, I would put my betting money on the fact that these revisions to these ancient manuscripts occurred during the Ottoman Caliphate. Because if the Ottoman Caliphate used the Hafs text and they controlled these ancient manuscripts, you can just imagine it very clearly. It's like the official version is the Hafs. We've got these ancient ones. They don't match the Hafs. So what do? We make them match. And they would have had the power, the opportunity, the motive, and the ability to do it as well.
They would have controlled all these manuscripts at that time in all the different cities.
And I think that's where this occurred. Now, so then that begs the question, why did they not have the confidence in that period just to go, well, all of these are the same, like the modern day apologists are doing? Why didn't they just have the same attitude as the modern day apologists and go, there's no need to change this, there's no need to revise this, because we're confident that this is preserved? Well, we're confident that this goes exactly. So what it's demonstrating is they did not have that confidence.
There you go.
They didn't have that confidence.
They did have the confidence, and they went and made claims that they could not support. And this is continuing on with the Dawah team that you're facing down at Speaker's Corner. They've just gone back into their old mantra again. This is the same thing that Yasir Qadhi had to do. He just went back into his old mantra. We just know. We don't question it. We have a red line we don't go beyond. He's now stopped at that red line and will not go beyond it. But the rest of you who are watching, and if there are Muslims watching, you've got to go. You've got to answer to us. Because don't ever say in our presence again that it's been preserved. Don't even say that there's one Quran.
It's a joke now.
Please stop saying it. It's a joke now. This is out. The cat's out. And YouTube has done us a great favor by getting this all over the world. And I've never seen this much fear amongst Muslims as I'm seeing now in the last 2 weeks. I've never seen as much apprehension. And of course, when you're going and you're looking, you're asking, when you see this kind of fear, when you can see this kind of disillusionment, I would suggest, Bob, that we're going to see a huge attrition of Muslims living in Islam. Because
Yeah.
if God cannot protect His word, if we don't have any Quran from the 7th century or even the 8th century, well, we don't even have a Quran from the 9th century that exactly follows the one that we have in our hand today. And that's what we're working on right now. We're looking at the Razm. This is the new thing. We're looking all the Razms of all the various manuscripts and comparing it with the Hafs. I'm not permitted to tell you what we're finding, but that's yet to come out.
I can tell it's going to be good because you've got that look in your eye. So what I would say, what I would ask Dr. Smith is, we know that there are Muslims that watch this channel. We know there are Muslims that will watch this video, and we are often accused of being Islamophobes because we have a desire and a love for Muslims to know the truth. So what would you say to any Muslim who's coming here with an open mind? They're seeing the fact that the hadiths don't support preserved text, and the Qur'an show that there's not a singular text, and now that the Rasim demonstrate that even ancient texts are corrupted and different, and they're now thinking to themselves, actually, maybe the narrative that I've been taught is false.
Yeah.
What would you say to those people?
I'd say, come on home. Come on home. I would say you might as well give up the Quran. The Quran is nothing more than a man-made document put together possibly in the 8th, probably the 9th, and still continued to be changed and accreted and deleted. And finally, it was chosen by the Ottomans, we think, but then was chosen by one man, Muhammad ibn al-Husayni al-Haddad in 1924.
What year?
But that was
1924.
But that was only for Cairo. It was chosen for all of Egypt in 1936, and then finally chosen for the whole world by King Fahd in 1985, which makes me older than the Quran. And that's why I say, if that's all you've got, then you can pretty well know that your God has not preserved the text. Your God has not guarded it. Why don't you come back to a better text, a bigger text? This is the one we know has gone through every test. And this text, we don't even make the claims you make about the Quran. We know it is written by men. We know it's not. It's been created. It's not uncreated. It's written by men. We give the name of many of the men who wrote it as the heading of each book. But it is the book that tells you exactly who God is, and it tells you who and what He did for you. And it is this God in this book that died for you, rose again, destroyed death, and is calling you home. So I say to those Muslims who are getting disillusioned, you don't have to go to this book anymore. You don't need to, because you cannot support no one. Even the Yasser Qadis of the world cannot support it anymore. Therefore, give it up and come on home. Come on home to the bigger, the better book. And for heaven's sakes, come on home to Jesus Christ. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. It has been a pleasure chatting with you. I did share the link to Dr. Shahad Salim's video, in which he talks about everything you've talked about in so much more detail, and he mentions stuff that even we've not mentioned, like redundant letters and so on. And I will get my tech guy to put it all in the description box. Thank you for your time. I hope this won't be the only show that we ever do together. It won't be the only time that we ever talk together, and I hope we'll talk again in the future.
God bless you. Now, just to say real quickly, I am on Fander Films now, going through a whole series of looking at all the historical problems of the Quran, because we're getting so many questions. I'm getting so many emails from people who are confused, who are upset, who don't know what to do with all this new information that's happened in 2 weeks. So I'm just going to go through a section by section of what we now know about how the Quran's preserved. The first one was up today. We'll be putting up more in the days to come.
Brilliant. So if you want more of a stage-by-stage introduction to the issues, you know where to go, and I will put the link to Dr. J's channel in the description box.
God bless you.
God bless you. Peace be with you. Take care.
And you. Bye-bye.